Weddings are supposed to be loud with joy, not strategy. This one was both. 500 guests, crystal lights hanging like borrowed stars, music thumping hard enough to make the floor feel alive. Everybody dressed to announce who they were, or who they wanted to be seen as. Power wears good tailoring. Control smiles wide. I stood near the back at first, hands folded, watching the room the way I always do. You learn early, when you grow up watching your mother swallow disrespect with grace, that the loudest people aren't always the ones running things. The quiet ones keep count. My mother moved through that room like she always does. Careful, polite, invisible on purpose. She wore a soft blue sari she'd ironed twice that morning. Not flashy, not loud, respectable. That was her armor. I watched people look past her, around her, through her, like she was furniture that had always been there and therefore didn't matter. The bride's family occupied the front rows like a council. Expensive suits, heels that clicked with confidence, laughter that carried. They controlled the mic, the seating, the schedule. They controlled the narrative. That's when it happened. Started small. A coordinator came over and whispered something to my mother, pointing toward the side aisle. She nodded, stood up, gathered her purse. I frowned. Her name was printed on the front row seating list. I'd seen it myself when I helped with logistics weeks earlier. But no one questioned a woman being quietly moved. Then the microphone crackled. "Before we continue," the bride's uncle said, smiling like this was part of the show, "we need to correct a small mix-up." People laughed softly. The safe kind of laughter. The kind you give when you don't want to stand out. He gestured toward my mother. Some guests seemed to have misunderstood their place. Tradition matters, after all. That word place hung heavy. My mother froze. For half a second, I saw it on her face. The instinct to disappear. Then she smiled. That same smile she wore when landlords talked down to her. When managers assumed she wouldn't understand contracts. When relatives treated her like help instead of family. The room laughed louder this time. I felt something rise in my chest. Hot, sharp, demanding movement. Every muscle in my body told me to stand up, to speak, to remind them who she was, who I was. I didn't, because I saw the glances they exchanged before the joke landed. The way the coordinator stepped back like she'd completed a task. The timing, perfect, rehearsed, smooth. This wasn't an accident. This was choreography. My mother moved to the side table they'd prepared, near the catering exit, near the noise of plates and servers. The symbolism wasn't subtle. It didn't need to be. I caught her eyes as she sat. She gave me a small nod. A warning. Don't. So I stayed still. People misread that kind of stillness. They think silence is surrender. They think calm is confusion. They don't realize some of us are quiet because we're listening for patterns. As the ceremony continued, speeches flowed like rehearsed praise. Family names were celebrated. Legacies mentioned. Wealth implied without being named. They talked about honor while practicing humiliation in the same breath. I watched my mother's hands under the table. They shook just enough to tell the truth she refused to speak. I memorized that tremor. I promised myself I would remember this exact feeling. Not rage. Clarity. The night ended with applause and music and fake warmth. People congratulated each other. No one apologized. Why would they? In their minds, everything had gone according to plan. On the walkout, one of the bride's cousins brushed past me and said, low enough to pretend it was nothing, "She should have known better." I looked at him. He didn't look back. Outside, the night air was cool, sharp against my skin. My mother walked beside me, posture straight, smile gone but dignity intact. She didn't say a word. Neither did I. But as we reached the car, I glanced back at that glowing hall full of laughter and borrowed power, and I understood something important. People who humiliate publicly are protecting something privately. And I had all night to start figuring out what it was. Humiliation doesn't always shout. Sometimes it rides home beside you in silence. The engine started with a soft hum, the kind of sound meant to reassure you that things were still working. The city lights blurred past the windshield as we pulled away from the wedding hall, laughter and music shrinking behind us like a memory already being rewritten. I kept both hands on the steering wheel. My grip was tight enough to ache. My mother sat in the passenger seat, back straight, purse resting neatly on her lap. She stared out the window, watching reflections of streetlights slide across the glass. If you didn't know her, you'd think she was calm, content even. I knew better. I waited for her to speak, to sigh, to say something small like, "It's fine," or "Don't worry about it." She didn't. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, like it had weight. "I'm sorry," I finally said. The words felt inadequate the moment they left my mouth. She turned to me then, her expression gentle in the way that hurts more than anger. "For what?" "For tonight," I said. "For how they—" She lifted her hand slightly, not to stop me, to steady herself. "It's not your fault," she said. Her voice was even, practiced. "And it's not worth ruining your night over." That sentence landed wrong. Not our night. Your night. As if she'd already removed herself from the moment. As if humiliation was something she carried alone, the way she always had. "They had no right?" I said, heat creeping into my voice despite my effort to keep it level. She nodded once. "They rarely need permission." That caught me off guard. I glanced at her. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "It's done. Let it go." There it was. The pattern I knew too well. Silence as survival. Endurance mistaken for strength. I wanted to argue, to tell her she deserved better. But I'd learned over the years that telling her that only made her retreat further. We drove another few blocks before she spoke again. "Do you remember?" she said slowly. "The name Mr. Caldwell?" My foot eased off the gas. "From when?" "Before you were born," she said. "A long time ago." The name stirred something faint in my memory. Old conversations. Lowered voices. A file folder I wasn't meant to touch. "He used to be around," she continued, eyes still on the window. "Before things changed." "What things?" I asked. She pressed her lips together. "It doesn't matter." It mattered. I didn't push, not yet. I nodded and turned onto our street. The apartment building looked the same as always. Modest, quiet, unimpressive to anyone who measured worth by square footage. Inside, she kicked off her shoes and went straight to the kitchen. Habit. She poured herself a glass of water, hands steady now. The shaking was gone, like it had never happened. "I'm going to lie down," she said. "You should get some rest too." She paused at the doorway, then added, "Don't do anything because of me." I watched her disappear into her room. The door closed softly behind her. That was when the weight hit me. Not anger. Responsibility. I sat at the kitchen table long after the apartment fell quiet. The wedding replayed in my head. Not the music, not the vows, but the moments in between. The looks, the coordination, the certainty with which they'd decided my mother's place. People don't humiliate like that unless they're confident. Confident people protect something. I stood up and opened the old cabinet above the fridge. Inside were folders my mother never threw away. Utility bills, old letters, documents yellowed at the edges. History most people didn't bother to question. I pulled one down at random, then another. Names, dates, addresses, and there it was. Caldwell. Not in a story, not in memory, on paper. My pulse quickened. I checked another folder, then another. The name appeared again, this time crossed out, replaced by handwriting that didn't match my mother's. My phone buzzed with a message from a cousin. "Crazy wedding. Huh? Guess some people need to know their place." I didn't reply. I opened my laptop instead. That night, while my mother slept in the next room believing silence would keep us safe, I realized something she'd never say out loud. This wasn't the first time they tried to erase her, and I wasn't going to let it happen again. People can lie for decades. Paper never forgets. The apartment was quiet in the way it only gets after midnight. No traffic, no voices, just the low hum of the refrigerator and the soft ticking of the clock above the sink. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open and a stack of folders spread out like I was performing an autopsy on my own past. I started slow. That's how you do this kind of thing. You don't rush truth. You let it surface on its own. Property records first. Public, searchable, boring enough that most people never look twice. I typed in the last name of the family who'd humiliated my mother, then narrowed the results by year. Transfers popped up in neat digital rows. Ownership changes. Corporate shells. Clean timelines. Too clean. I leaned back in my chair, rubbing my eyes. Grief and anger can make patterns where none exist. I reminded myself of that. I wasn't here to prove a feeling. I was here to verify a fact. So I cross-checked. Marriage records. Business filings. Archived news articles from before everything went digital. Grainy scans, misaligned text, names spelled differently depending on who was reporting. That's where things started to feel wrong. A company announcement from years ago credited the bride's grandfather as a founding partner. Another article, older, listed 2 partners. The second name stopped me cold. Caldwell. I pulled the paper folder closer, flipped through until I found the handwritten note I'd seen earlier. Same name, same spelling, crossed out, replaced with another surname, the one now sitting comfortably at the front row of weddings. My pulse beat harder in my ears. I kept digging. Death records were next. A man named Caldwell had died unexpectedly decades ago. Cause listed as natural. No dependents mentioned. No estate complications noted. That alone was strange. Men who build companies don't leave nothing behind. They leave messes. Lawyers. Arguments. I searched probate filings. There it was. An estate settlement finalized in under 3 months. I stared at the screen. Fast didn't mean illegal, but it often meant guided. I opened the document. Pages loaded slowly, like they didn't want to be seen. Near the bottom, in smaller print, was a clause referencing a secondary beneficiary. Initials only. M.A. My mother's initials. I felt the room tilt slightly, like my body had shifted but my mind hadn't caught up yet. No, I whispered. I double-checked, then triple-checked. Birth records confirmed it. Her full name matched the initials. Her age lined up. Her address at the time was listed. An old apartment she'd once mentioned in passing. A place she'd left quickly. I remembered her saying, "Some things are better forgotten." Someone had made sure of that. What hit me hardest wasn't the theft. It was the precision. The document had been amended legally 2 years after the original filing. A quiet revision that removed the secondary beneficiary. Signed by a lawyer who later joined the family's company board. That kind of move doesn't happen without intent. I sat there for a long time, hands resting on the table, heart steady but heavy. Rage would have been easier. Rage burns fast and leaves nothing behind. This required something colder. I printed everything. Dates, names, cross-references. Then I placed the papers back into their folders, sliding them carefully like they were fragile. My phone buzzed again. Another message from the wedding group chat, photos, laughter, jokes about tradition. I turned the phone face down. Around 3 in the morning, I stood up and stretched. My reflection in the dark window looked different. Not older, focused, like someone who'd just been handed a map they didn't know they were looking for. I thought about my mother's smile. The way she'd accepted humiliation like it was familiar, like it was the cost of existing in rooms she didn't control. They hadn't just moved her seat. They'd moved her out of history, and that meant one thing. What they were protecting wasn't pride. It was paper. And paper, once exposed, doesn't care who's laughing. They didn't just remove my mother from the table. They removed her from history. Morning came without sleep. The sky outside the kitchen window shifted from black to gray, while I sat there surrounded by paper and quiet realization. My eyes burned, but my mind stayed sharp. Once you see the outline of a lie, you can't unsee it. You start noticing where it's been patched, where it's been reinforced. I went back further. That's the mistake people make. They stop once they find proof. They don't ask why the proof exists the way it does. I wasn't looking for validation anymore. I was looking for intent. I traced the company's origin story like a bloodline. Early permits, vendor contracts, bank registrations from a time when things were handwritten and harder to erase. Names appeared and disappeared depending on the year. Titles shifted subtly. Co-founder became consultant. Partner turned into associate, and then vanished. Caldwell's name didn't just fade. It stopped abruptly, as if someone had slammed a door on it. I pulled up court records tied to the amended estate filing. The lawyer who signed off on the revision had a familiar last name, same as the bride's mother before marriage. That detail hadn't been hidden, it had just never been connected. People assume conspiracies are loud. They aren't. They're boring. They hide inside legal language and family dinners and shared holidays. They survive because everyone involved benefits from pretending nothing happened. Except one person, my mother. I remembered things differently now. Her hesitation around paperwork. Her refusal to attend certain gatherings. The way she avoided talking about her early 20s like that decade had been cut clean out of her life. She hadn't lost something. It had been taken. I stood up and paced the kitchen, careful not to wake her. My footsteps felt heavier now, like the floor knew something I hadn't known yesterday. I stopped in front of the old bookshelf by the hallway, the one she never reorganized. Old textbooks, photo albums, a shoebox pushed to the back. I pulled it out slowly. Inside were photographs wrapped in tissue paper. Younger faces, different smiles. My mother, years before exhaustion softened her edges. Standing beside a man I didn't recognize, but the resemblance was undeniable. Same eyes, same posture, same quiet confidence that didn't need to perform. Caldwell. There were letters too. Not romantic, practical. Discussions about work, plans, numbers scribbled in margins. They read like equal speaking, not a boss and a subordinate. At the bottom of the box was a folded document, creased from being opened and closed too many times. I unfolded it carefully, a draft agreement, and signed. But my mother's name was there in full. Not initials, not crossed out. Written clearly, confidently, like it belonged. I exhaled slowly. That was when the pieces locked into place. The wedding humiliation wasn't random cruelty. It wasn't arrogance. It was preventative. They knew the truth existed. They just believed it was buried deep enough to stay dead. They humiliated her publicly to remind her, and anyone watching, that she had no standing, no claim, no voice. Fear wears tradition like a mask. I slid everything back into the box and returned it to the shelf. This wasn't the moment for confrontation. Not with her. Not with them. Truth doesn't need drama, it needs timing. Later that afternoon, my mother sat across from me at the table, sipping tea like it was any other day. Her face was calm, guarded. "You're quiet," she said. "I'm listening," I replied. She studied me for a moment, then looked away. "Sometimes," she said carefully, "it's better to let things stay buried." I met her eyes. "Who buried them?" Her hand tightened around the cup, just for a second. "That family," she said finally, "has always been afraid of losing what they took." She stood up before I could ask more, carrying her cup to the sink. The conversation was over on her terms. But it didn't matter anymore. I didn't need permission to move forward. I had confirmation. And more importantly, I had context. Someone inside that family had helped erase her. Not just legally, socially, emotionally. They'd trained her to believe silence was safety. I watched her rinse the cup, shoulders squared, dignity intact despite everything that had been stolen from her. And I understood something that made my stomach settle into calm resolve. They didn't humiliate my mother because they were powerful. They humiliated her because they were afraid she still mattered. And fear always leaves a trail. Not everyone stays loyal out of love. Some do it out of fear. The message came 2 days later, short and careful, like it had been written with someone looking over their shoulder. "We need to talk." Not by phone. The number wasn't saved in my contacts, but I recognized it. A distant cousin by marriage. Someone who'd always hovered at the edges of family gatherings. Present, polite, never central. The kind of person people forget to watch because they seem harmless. I replied with a single word. When? The cafe we met at was quiet and forgettable, tucked between a pharmacy and a dry cleaner. Neutral ground. No cameras. No reason to be noticed. He arrived 10 minutes early and chose a seat facing the door. That told me everything I needed to know about his state of mind. "You didn't hear this from me?" he said before we'd even ordered. "I haven't heard anything yet," I replied. He let out a tight breath and rubbed his palms together. "They're scared." I kept my face neutral. "Of what?" "Of your mother," he said. Then, correcting himself, "Of what your mother represents." That landed heavy. He glanced around the cafe, then leaned in. "That wedding? That wasn't just disrespect. That was a reminder. To her. To themselves." I didn't interrupt. "They've always known the truth," he continued. "About Caldwell. About the company. About how things really started." "Then why hasn't it ever come out?" I asked. "Because paper can be buried," he said quietly. "And people can be convinced they don't matter." I thought of my mother's smile, the practiced calm, the years of self-erasure. "What do you know?" I asked. He hesitated, then reached into his bag and slid a folder across the table. "Not proof. Context." Inside were copies, meeting notes, email printouts from years ago, internal memos that never made it outside the company. They told the same story my research had hinted at, but from the inside. Redirections, renamings, decisions made in closed rooms. "They didn't inherit the company," he said. "They redirected it." "Why help me now?" I asked. He laughed without humor. "Because they're not as careful anymore. Power makes people sloppy. And fear." I added. "That too." He explained how the older generation had controlled the narrative, how dissent had been rewarded with access and punished with exile, how silence was framed as loyalty, how your mother's absence had become convenient. "She left quietly," he said. "That made it easier." "She didn't leave," I said. "She was pushed." He nodded. "I know." I closed the folder. "Why didn't you speak before?" He met my eyes then, and for the first time I saw something like shame. "Because I liked my seat." The honesty surprised me. "I don't anymore," he added. "They're circling, freezing people out, closing ranks. That kind of behavior only happens when something's about to surface." I leaned back in my chair. "What happens if this comes out?" "They lose more than money," he said. "They lose legitimacy." That was the word I'd been waiting for. We parted without shaking hands. No promises made. No alliances declared. Just an understanding built on mutual self-interest. That night, I laid everything out on my desk. My documents. A timeline formed naturally now, like it had been waiting for confirmation. The family's wealth wasn't just stolen. It was borrowed. Borrowed from a truth they couldn't afford to return. I looked at my phone and saw missed calls from an unfamiliar number. Voicemails left but unsent. Someone testing boundaries. I didn't call back. Instead, I made an appointment. Not with them. With a lawyer. Not to confront. Not yet. To verify. Because when systems move, they move quietly. And the people who think they're in control rarely hear the sound until it's too late. They mistook my silence for submission. That was their last advantage. Power, I learned, is loud when it's insecure and quiet when it's real. The family that humiliated my mother specialized in performance. Grand gestures, public generosity, controlled narratives. They hosted galas, funded causes, smiled for cameras. All of it designed to reinforce the same message. We belong here. I let them believe I did too. I kept attending events, nodding politely, staying invisible. People relax when they think you're harmless. They start talking freely. They stop guarding doors. The lawyer's office smelled like old paper and polished wood. He listened without interrupting as I laid everything out. Documents, timelines, inconsistencies. When I finished, he sat back and steepled his fingers. "This isn't about revenge," he said. "No," I agreed. "It's about correction." He studied me for a long moment. You understand this won't be fast. I don't need fast, I said. I need precise. That earned a small smile. Over the next weeks, I learned how systems breathe, how filings trigger reviews, how questions create ripples. We didn't accuse. We asked. Requests for clarification, notices of inquiry, formal letters that read polite but carried weight. The first sign came quietly. A property listing vanished. Then a charity announcement was postponed due to internal restructuring. I watched from the outside as their rhythm faltered. Nothing dramatic, just off, like dancers missing a step. My mother noticed it too. They seemed stressed, she said one evening after running into one of them at the grocery store. I kept my voice neutral. Change does that. She looked at me carefully. You're not involved in this, are you? I met her gaze. I'm paying attention. That was enough. She didn't push. Meanwhile, I discovered something they didn't know. Years ago, during a brief period of cooperation, my mother had been listed as a temporary signatory on an account tied to the company's early operations. Her name had been removed later, but the record of access remained. Access leaves traces. Those traces mattered. Through legal channels, we requested archived account activity. It was routine, boring, irrefutable. When the bank complied, the trail confirmed what we already suspected. Funds had moved in ways that contradicted the public story. Not illegal, just inconsistent. Inconsistencies invite audits. The family began closing ranks. Meetings held behind closed doors. Calls made late at night. People stopped smiling as much. They didn't look at me once. That told me everything. I wasn't the threat they were watching for. They expected confrontation, anger, noise. They didn't expect paperwork. One afternoon, I received an email addressed to my mother, forwarded to me by mistake. It was polite, overly so. We hope there are no misunderstandings. We value harmony. Harmony is what people ask for when control starts slipping. I deleted it. By the end of the month, we were ready. Not for exposure. Not for spectacle. For leverage. Everything hinged on one document. One truth they'd spent decades burying. I held it in my hands and felt nothing. No triumph. No rage. Just certainty. Timing, I'd learned, is everything. And they had no idea the clock was already running. Their power rested on one lie, and that lie had my mother's name on it. The document arrived in a plain envelope, no logo, no return address. The kind of mail people overlook because it doesn't announce importance. I recognized the weight the moment I picked it up. Paper like that carries history. I didn't open it right away. I set it on the table and sat across from it, hands folded, breathing slow. There are moments when you know your life is about to split into before and after. This was one of them. When I finally slid my finger under the seal, I understood why they'd worked so hard to keep this buried. It wasn't fraud in the way people expect. No forged signatures, no stolen checks. It was worse, cleaner, legal. The company that made their name, their money, their influence, it was never fully theirs. The original structure listed 3 parties. 2 public, 1 silent. The silent party wasn't a minor contributor. She wasn't an assistant or an afterthought. She was the stabilizer. My mother had been listed as a conditional beneficiary and operational guarantor. Someone whose consent mattered if certain thresholds were crossed. Profits, transfers, mergers, dissolutions. She wasn't visible because she wasn't meant to be. She was insurance. When Caldwell died, that insurance became inconvenient. They didn't remove her outright. That would have raised questions. Instead, they waited. Let time pass. Let her step away under pressure. Then they amended language quietly, reframing her role as temporary, non-essential, resolved. On paper, it looked clean. In reality, it wasn't enforceable without her acknowledgement, which had never been given. I felt something in my chest loosen. Not relief, not joy, recognition. The wedding humiliation made sense now. They hadn't been flexing power. They'd been checking to see if she remembered who she was. I thought back to her words in the kitchen. Some things are better buried. She hadn't meant forgotten. She'd meant protected. The next part of the file explained everything else. Why certain deals stalled, why expansions always hit invisible ceilings, why they'd needed favors instead of outright ownership. Their authority existed because no one challenged the assumption that it was complete. Assumptions are dangerous. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. My hands were steady. That surprised me. I'd expected anger, vindication, something loud. Instead, I felt calm, because now I understood the real reason they'd never confronted my mother directly. If she spoke, everything unraveled. And if she stayed quiet, they could keep pretending control was absolute. I didn't wake her. I didn't tell her what I'd found. Not yet. This truth wasn't meant to be delivered like an apology. It was meant to move through systems. I scanned the documents, encrypted them, sent copies to the lawyer. No commentary, no emotion, just facts. His reply came an hour later. This changes everything. I knew. What they'd built rested on compliance, not ownership. On silence, not strength. And silence had limits. By afternoon, the machinery began to turn. Not announcements, not accusations, requests, clarifications. A formal notice asking for acknowledgement of unresolved interests tied to early operational agreements. That kind of notice doesn't accuse. It freezes. By evening, calls were being made. Voices lowered. Names whispered. People who'd never doubted their position suddenly unsure which doors were still open. They didn't call my mother. They called lawyers. That told me who they were really afraid of. I stood at the window as the sun dipped behind the buildings, the city glowing like nothing had changed. Somewhere across town, a family that once laughed at my mother's humiliation was realizing something fundamental. They had never been in control. They had just been uninterrupted. I picked up my phone, saw the missed calls piling up, and set it back down. No warning, no confrontation, just truth finally breathing. And once truth starts moving, it doesn't stop because someone asks nicely. I didn't confront them. I filed paperwork. That's the thing about real power, it doesn't announce itself. It moves through channels most people never bother to learn, and by the time its effects are visible, the decision has already been made. The first notification came on a Tuesday morning. Not dramatic. No raised voices. Just an automated email confirming receipt of a request for review. Language so neutral it felt harmless. It wasn't. By noon, a second notice arrived. This one from a financial institution requesting clarification on legacy agreements tied to early operational accounts. That kind of request doesn't come unless someone has pulled a thread that leads somewhere inconvenient. I forwarded everything to the lawyer. He replied with a single line, "Stay silent." So I did. Meanwhile, they started to unravel. Not publicly. Not yet. But in the ways that matter. Meetings postponed. Contracts paused. Pending review. A scheduled fundraiser quietly canceled with no explanation. When power depends on momentum, hesitation is a warning sign. I ran into one of them by chance at a parking garage downtown. He didn't see me at first. He was on the phone, voice low, strained. "No, I don't care how it looks," he hissed. "Just fix it." He turned, saw me, and froze. I nodded politely and kept walking. That small moment, his fear, my calm, told me everything. They didn't know what I knew. They only knew something was wrong. At home, my mother watched the evening news while folding laundry. A brief segment mentioned a local company, reviewing its founding documents amid internal audits. She glanced at the screen, then at me. "That's them, isn't it?" I didn't lie. "Yes." She sat down slowly. "Why now?" "Because they forced the timing," I said. She considered that, then nodded. No anger, no shock, just acceptance. "They always thought silence meant safety," she said. "They forgot silence has an end." Over the next few days, the pressure increased. Not from them directly, they were too careful for that, but from the absence of things they relied on. Access delayed. Approvals stalled. Partners suddenly cautious. Control evaporates fastest when people stop returning your calls. One evening, an email arrived addressed to me this time. Polite, professional, requesting a conversation to clear up misunderstandings. I deleted it. Another came the next day, more urgent, still respectful. I didn't respond, because the systems were doing exactly what they were designed to do: force accountability without emotion. Behind closed doors, they argued. I knew because my phone buzzed with messages from people suddenly eager to distance themselves. Former allies asking neutral questions. Old acquaintances wanting to catch up. Fear makes people flexible. By the end of the week, the real damage began. A bank froze a line of credit pending clarification of beneficiary status. A regulatory body flagged a discrepancy between public disclosures and historical filings. Nothing accusatory, just questions. Questions destroy illusions. They couldn't bully a process. They couldn't charm a form. And they couldn't humiliate their way out of this. The final call came late Friday night. A number I recognized but hadn't saved. I let it ring. The voicemail that followed was careful, controlled, strained. "We just want to talk. There's no need for this to get complicated." I listened once, then deleted it. Complicated was their word for exposed. That night, I sat on the balcony with my mother. The city hummed below us, indifferent to private collapses. She sipped her tea, hand steady. "You didn't raise your voice," she said softly. "I learned from you," I replied. She smiled then. Not the polite smile from the wedding, but a real one. The kind that comes when a weight you've carried for years finally shifts. Somewhere across town, people who'd laughed at her were realizing that control doesn't come from volume or numbers. It comes from legitimacy. And theirs was slipping quietly, permanently. Power looks loud, until it starts leaking. The collapse didn't come with headlines or sirens. It came in whispers, in hesitations, in people suddenly too busy to attend meetings they once dominated. That's how you know control was never solid, it was just unchallenged. I watched it happen from a distance, like observing a structure rot from the inside. One day it's standing. The next, no one trusts it to hold weight. A week after the audits began, a mutual acquaintance called me. Someone who used to introduce himself with their family name first, like it was a credential. "Crazy times," he said, forcing a laugh. "Things are shifting." I let the silence stretch. "They're saying there were misunderstandings," he added. "Old paperwork. Nothing serious. Misunderstandings don't freeze accounts." I ended the call politely and went back to work. The more normal I acted, the more unstable they became. People expect revenge to be emotional. They don't know what to do with indifference. The first real fracture showed up at a public event. A charity dinner they'd sponsored for years. Same venue, same donors, different energy. I wasn't invited. Neither were they. The invitation list had changed. Quietly, no announcement, just absence. That kind of exclusion hurts more than public embarrassment. It tells you the room has already decided. By then, they knew it was me. I found out through a third party. Someone who shouldn't have known but did. They said my name carefully, like it might bite them. "He figured it out," the person said. Too late. I didn't ask who he was. I knew. They started reaching out, not directly at first. Messages sent through intermediaries. Suggestions of mediation. Offers to clear the air. Air doesn't need clearing when the truth is already circulating. My mother felt it too. Strangers were kinder. Old acquaintances warmer. People who'd once spoken over her now listened closely, like they were recalibrating something they'd misjudged for years. One afternoon, she came home from the market and said, "They asked me how I was." I looked up. Who did? She named one of them. Someone who'd laughed at the wedding. "They seemed uncertain," she said, like they weren't sure who they were speaking to anymore. That's when it hit me. This wasn't about money, or documents, or even legacy. It was about narrative. They'd built an identity on dominance, on deciding who mattered and who didn't. The moment that authority cracked, everything built on top of it lost shape. By the end of the month, the company announced a strategic pause. No expansion, no events, just reassessment. People read between lines like that. Investors stepped back. Partners asked questions. Doors that once swung open now required explanation. And still I said nothing. The final attempt came in the form of a letter. Hand-delivered. Thick envelope. Heavy paper. Apology adjacent without admitting fault. They acknowledged past oversights. Expressed a desire to restore harmony. Offered a private meeting. No lawyers. That part made me laugh. I returned the letter unopened. Not out of spite. Out of completion. Because the moment they asked to talk without witnesses, they admitted what they'd always known. They were never entitled to control. They just counted on silence. One evening, my mother and I walked past the old wedding hall. Another event was being set up, different people, different names on the banner. She stopped and looked at it for a moment. No bitterness. No regret. They don't look so big anymore, she said. They never were, I replied. As we walked away, I understood something that surprised me. This didn't feel like victory. Felt like balance. Power hadn't been taken. It had been returned to where it always belonged. And they would never fully recover from knowing that the person they humiliated was the one holding the truth that undid them. Silently, completely. Revenge doesn't need witnesses. Morning arrived like it always does. Soft light through the curtains. The city waking up without asking who deserved peace. I stood at the kitchen sink, watching steam rise from my coffee, listening to the normal sounds of a day beginning. No sirens. No announcements. No victory lap. That's how I knew it was over. My phone was quiet now. No missed calls. No emails marked urgent. The silence felt different than before, lighter, settled, like a door that had finally closed all the way instead of hovering on its hinges. Across the table, my mother read the newspaper. She took her time, turning each page carefully, as if savoring the ordinary. Her shoulders were relaxed in a way I hadn't seen in years. Not because she was happy, but because she was no longer bracing for impact. "They're stepping down," she said, eyes still on the page. I didn't ask who. I already knew. "Interim management," she continued. "Independent review. That's what this says." I nodded. "That usually means permanent." She folded the paper and set it aside. For a moment, she just looked at her hands. Then she said something I wasn't expecting. "I thought I had made peace with it," she said quietly. "With losing what I never got to keep." I waited. "But I hadn't," she added. "I'd just gotten used to carrying it." That was the cost they never accounted for. Not money. Not ownership. The weight they'd forced her to live with while they smiled in rooms she wasn't allowed to enter. "You don't have to carry it anymore," I said. She smiled, not softly, not politely, fully, like a woman remembering herself. Later that day, we walked through the neighborhood together. Nothing ceremonial. Just errands. Groceries. Sunlight. People nodded at her like they always had, but something in her posture had changed. She wasn't smaller anymore. She didn't rush. She didn't apologize for taking up space. At the corner store, someone asked her opinion on a display. She answered without hesitation. The sound of her voice, steady, certain, caught me off guard. This was the real victory. Not exposure. Not collapse. Restoration. By afternoon, the news cycle moved on. Another scandal. Another story. The world doesn't linger on quiet endings. It doesn't need to. The people who matter already feel the shift. I checked my email once. A final message sat unread, sent hours earlier. No subject line, just a name I recognized. I deleted it without opening. Because revenge doesn't need closure conversations. It needs boundaries. That evening, my mother stood by the window watching the city lights come on. She reached for my hand. Not in gratitude, not in relief. In recognition. "You didn't embarrass them," she said. "No," I replied. "I let them be seen." She nodded. "That's stronger." I thought back to the wedding, the laughter, the microphone, the wordplay thrown like a verdict. I understood now how fragile that moment had been for them, and how permanent it had been for her. They'd tried to remind her of her place. Instead, they reminded me of mine. Not above them, not beneath them, outside the performance altogether. That night, I slept without replaying conversations in my head, without planning the next move. without waiting for the other shoe to drop. Some endings don't arrive with noise. They arrive with rest. Before turning off the light, I looked at my mother's door. Closed, peaceful, undisturbed. Control hadn't been taken from them in a single dramatic act. It had dissolved the moment truth was allowed to exist without interruption. They would spend the rest of their lives knowing this. The person they humiliated never needed to raise her voice, and the son they ignored never needed to raise his.